part of my work has been over the years doing an exploration of psychosurgery and deep brain stimulation in psychiatry as a prelude to the work that we did with consciousness, because the psychiatric work was actually ahead of the work that we did in consciousness. So I've had this kind of dual or bicoastal kind of existence and learning by analogy. And one of the points that we're making, and I think it's very important, is a lot of times what counts as a success is predetermined by market forces and the parameters that you establish antecedently before you actually undergo the trial. So our argument is that let's not say a trial that only had 26% of the people doing well as a failure. Let's look at the people who succeeded and try to understand why they were successful, and then try to learn from that experience and iterate that in changing the parameters for the people who were implanted. After all, these people have hardware in their head, right? So the impact, the cost, emotional and economic and investment has already been made. And so the ethics, we think, is to convert the failures into successes based on what we can learn. And that would require a different kind of trial design. And I think, and I'll get into my talk in a second, that a lot of what we do with devices and is literally an explant, no pun intended, but intended, from the drug world. And the FDA regs and how we think about clinical trials assumes big populations, drugs, small cost per unit, and you can have a small effect in lots of people. It's a different kind of utilitarianism. With the context of deep brain stimulation, you have trials with 20 or 30 people, if that many, and you have to hit for extra base hits every time. You have to hit a double or a triple or a home run, or it's a failure. So we have to really think about the ethics and the clinical trial design for device trials. It's a really different kind of configuration. Okay, that wasn't my talk. But we're all here to learn. So I'm going to be talking about covert consciousness, these people who are in the minimally conscious state, and what it means for our obligations to this population. And my favorite sort of patron saint philosopher was John Dewey. And he was a philosopher who was very interested in science, Darwin, technology, and he really used the scientific method to understand normative questions. And he spoke of how inventions of new agencies and instruments, technologies, create new ends, they create new consequences, which stir men and women to form new purposes. And everything that I have done in neuroethics has been determined by the technology that has evolved. And there are two kinds of technologies. One is diagnostic technologies that make us aware of problems that heretofore we are unaware of. So, for example, you think somebody is inert, they're vegetative, they're permanently unconscious. You put them in the scanner, you realize that they're there, and all of a sudden you have an obligation to them. And then you have the therapeutic side of the technology, like deep brain stimulation. So I'm going to talk about technology, and this is really an old story in medicine. This is a picture of Lenexa, a treatise on auscultation of the heart and the stethoscope. And that changed medicine. It allowed clinicians, physicians to engage in more comprehensive physical diagnosis. And our era is really no different, using modern ways of looking inside the brain with fMRI and PET scan. And it's going to transform our categories, which heretofore in neurology have been descriptive. They've been based on behavioral metrics, not underlying physiology. Okay, so what you see is not always what you get. And it's so much like genotype and phenotype. Okay, until Mendel had his garden, all the roses were apparently the same, but under the hood, they were different. So my talk is in really 3 parts. And if I don't know if we could turn the clock on so I know how long we have. We have 3 parts here. First is the diagnostic part, and thinking about neuroimaging and disorders of consciousness and how this new knowledge has transformed our categories. Secondly, we'll be talking about deep brain stimulation and other ways of intervening in the injured brain, and some of the research ethics questions that we had to confront to do that. And then thirdly, why this matters at all and why we should really, really care. And to do that, I will refer to work that informed my book, Rights Come to Mind, Brain Injury Ethics and the Struggle for Consciousness, published by Cambridge last year. And just on a point of methods, I did interviews, in-depth narrative interviews with over 50 families, and I will be mentioning some of them by name. And I have an IRB-approved protocol and HIPAA protection waivers to be able to share their information. An ethicist who doesn't share that with you, Ruth would disown me, so I've got to be very careful there. Okay, if you'd like a review article on disorders of conscience, we published this in Nature Reviews Neuroscience back in 2014 in January. So it's a couple of years old, but you might find it useful. And I just want to, since it's very important that we're all on the same page, and even with really learned people, sometimes we conflate and we say, oh, those people are all basically brain dead. But there's a difference. These are differences that make an ethical and physiologic difference. So this is the brain in sagittal section. And we're going to talk about brain death, coma, the vegetative state, the persistent and permanent vegetative state, and I'm going to focus on the minimally conscious state and the emergence from the minimally conscious state. So just to understand the physiology, brain death is whole brain death. Coma is a temporary brain state, an eyes closed state of unresponsiveness. It doesn't last forever, so somebody who's been in a coma for 3 years, unless it's medically induced, it's not a coma, okay? And people grow out of their coma, either die or they wake up. I could talk for a very long time and put you into a coma, and hopefully you'd wake up. You have anesthesia, you wake up. So it's a temporary brain state. And the recovery of the brainstem in isolation, that's the part down here, without higher cortical function is the vegetative state. And depending on how long it lasts, it's either unmodified, persistent, or permanent. We'll talk more about that. One of the most important things I'll say is that it started off as being called a persistent vegetative state, but in fact, and abbreviated as PVS. But abbreviating PVS as PVS could be persistent or permanent is a category error that has huge implications for patients and policy. So you'll be very careful about that. And then from the vegetative state, if it doesn't become permanent, okay, you can move into the minimally conscious state, which I'll define. But I just want to draw your attention to our friend here, Vesalius, who's standing at a podium much like this one, contemplating his own skull. So we do this with humility and a sense of our own frailty and fragility, in the sense that this too will pass, and one day people will look at what I'm saying now, which may be new to some of you, and will say, they were so wrong. So we have to have humility in science and not hubris. Okay. This is another way, another schematic of looking at it, and I'm going to go through this and talk about how these brain states have been changed and evolved because of neuroimaging. So you have a loss, we're talking about brain injuries that are significant enough to lose consciousness. You could have very significant brain injury without loss of consciousness, concussion, for example. So you could have whole brain death, okay? And in whole brain death, the patient actually looks better than their skin. Of course, brain death was originated in 1968 by Henry K. Beecher, who was an anesthesiologist up at Harvard. And it was really a utilitarian move to retrieve organs from people who could supply for the organs for the first heart transplant was in 1968. Interestingly, the year before the Harvard Ad Hoc Committee published the brain death criteria, which is whole brain death, Beecher published an article in New England Journal of Medicine to retrieve organs from the hopelessly comatose. And that was a little too extreme, and this is where they ended up. But look at the scan. This is an imaging scan of a person who was brain dead, and the patient actually is there. She's in bed. She's got a heartbeat. She's perfused. They look like they're alive, but their scan looks worse than they do. And there's a discordance between the exam and the image. And I saw this vividly once. I was doing a brain death case at the hospital, and we'd just done the apnea test where you let the carbon dioxide go up, and hypercapnia should trigger a respiration. And the pulmonologist was there, and he figured it all out with the blood gases, and we determined the patient was brain dead. And then after we had done that, and we were about to pronounce the patient goes like this, like she's praying. And it's called the Lazarus sign for a reason, and it's a cervical reflex. The very pulmonologist who had just said the patient was brain dead based on those criteria reaches over to try to put her arms down because he was so disturbed by what he saw. His heart and his mind were discordant. The neurologist pushed him away. Neurologist, to save the day, he says, don't do that. That's the Lazarus reflex. You'll see that once in your life. And what it was a cervical reflex. But even a professional who knew exactly what was going on found it discordant. And brain death is kind of a human creation, and it's only a creation because of ventilators, all right? So the patient here looks better than their image. All right, so we go from brain death, they don't die, they're in the coma for 2 weeks, it's self-limited, and now they move into the vegetative state. And the vegetative state, if it lasts a month, is called persistent, and depending on the etiology of the brain injury, 3 or 12 months, it becomes permanent or not. And here's the originators of the vegetative state. Our teacher, Fred Plum, over here, who was also known for the locked-in state, and Bryan and Jeanette, who's known for the Glasgow Coma Scale, and they actually collaborated together. And they described this as a syndrome in search of a name, and they described it as a state of wakeful unresponsiveness. Perfect Fred Plum aphorism, right? Eyes are open, but there's no awareness of self, others, or the environment. And imagine how disquieting this is for families. Somebody's in a coma, they wake up, their eyes open, and if you read Karen and Quinlan's parents' memoir, they talk about how devastated they were when they realized those eyes that were open were not seeing, that she just had random eye movement. That's the vegetative state. And they wrote about this in '72. And here's images of 5 patients all in the vegetative state. And this is metabolic activity here on this side in an fMRI. And this is a paper that Nico Schiff, my colleague, was the lead author on. And Fred was actually an author on this as well, Rodolfo Linus. And this shows a lot of things, but what I want you to focus on is that patients who have anoxic brain injury in panels D and E have a more global decrease in metabolic activity. And they declare themselves in 3 months. People who have traumatic brain injury over here can have huge swaths of activity, and they take a year to be definitively declared as permanently vegetative. Okay, so that's a difference. The other thing I want you to notice is that this patient seems to have a lot of residual brain structures, but has a structural injury in the thalamus. And the thalamus is going to be important when we talk about deep brain stimulation later. The thalamus is to the brain what Hartsfield Airport is to Delta Airlines. It's the hub. And the brain is organized from cortical, thalamocortical tracts. And if the thalamus is injured, you can have a strategic injury in the thalamus and become vegetative. In fact, the AAN is writing new prognostic guidelines about traumatic brain injury, and a lot of it hinges on the status of the thalamus vis-a-vis a prognosis. So this is important for the etiology of the brain injury, whether it's anoxic brain injury or traumatic brain injury, and when you cross this threshold and you move into the permanent vegetative state. So Terri, Schiavo, Karen and Quinlan, these were people who were permanently vegetative. They were never going to recover ever again. So, but people who are persistent, who have yet to move into the vegetative state, 6, 7 weeks after their brain injury, they go off to a nursing home, they're still vegetative, and they have a surreptitious recovery, okay? And when they're in a nursing home, okay, they recover and they move into the minimally conscious state, but nobody knows that they've done that, okay? Because they look as if they're vegetative. They carried the diagnosis from the fancy academic medical center where they were seen by fancy neurologists who said the person was vegetative. You leave the hospital, you got diabetes, you're still going to have diabetes. But these are not diagnoses. These are brain states, and they can change. And the minimally conscious state is different than the vegetative state. It was first codified, as it were, through a consensus panel, which I know is low on the evidentiary scale, in 2002, and the Aspen criteria. These are actually real aspen trees. And Joe Giacino, who's our colleague, who's a neuropsychologist, and others wrote the guidelines and the definition for MCS. So these people have intention, attention, memory. They'll reach for a cup. When you walk into the room, they'll track you. They might even say their name. They might follow a command. The challenge is they do this behavior episodically and intermittently, okay? So if somebody thought that their loved one was demonstrating behavior, and then the doctor comes into the nursing home, once a week, not generally a neurologist, usually a family doctor or an internist, they said, Joe, when we say his name, sometimes he looks up, and the doctor says, Joe, say your name. Joe doesn't do anything. What happens? The doctor thinks the family's in denial. They don't believe that it's true. But in fact, that's the nature of the biology of the brain state. And that has led to a diagnostic error rate upwards of 40%. Carolyn Schnackers and others have published a paper, and there have been some other papers in the 20 to 40-ish% range, Her study showed that 41% of people with a traumatic brain injury in a nursing home thought to be vegetative were actually minimally conscious. So we have a 40% error rate saying that people are not in the room when in fact they are in the room. That's an ethical problem, okay? But it's also procedural, okay? So who brought this to everybody's attention? Who's the poster child for minimally conscious states? Case of Terri Wallace, who has been to Cornell a number of times, and I've interviewed his mom. So he was in a car accident in 1984, and then in 2003, 19 years later, he had a miracle awakening. It was all ascribed to religion in the media and all kinds of miracles and the like. And they said he woke up from a coma. Well, we know that's not true because comas don't last 19 years, or the persistent vegetative state, or the permanent vegetative state. He had actually been in the minimally conscious state when I reviewed his medical records 3 or 4 months into his injury. The family was noticing some behaviors, but there was no category for him to be in because it didn't exist until 2002. So his first words were mom and Pepsi. I prefer Diet Coke, but we'll take it. He was Rip Van Winkle. He was stuck in 1984. Ronald Reagan was president. And review of his behaviors again indicated he was in the minimally conscious state. The family asked for a neurologist to see him. They were told it wouldn't be paid for. He developed contractures. His brain was getting better. His body was deteriorating. More recently, he's turned to his mother. He said, "Mama, life is good." He has begun to regain his sense of time over the last year or so. And the most interesting thing about Terri is a story to me that happened in the early 90s. And this is how, as we learn more things, we have to challenge our nosology or diagnostic categories. So early in the 90s, and I recount this in the book, Mrs. Wallace gets a call from the nursing home where Terri resides. And most of these people end up in nursing homes. And the nurse's aide calls. Nurse aides don't know anything about the brain states and the categories, and they say, Terri's not right. And what had happened is a man in the adjoining bed in his room, an elderly man with dementia, had asphyxiated himself and died in the bed. And Terri witnessed this, and was sort of like stunned. His eyes were wide open and upset. And the nurses called me, this is Mrs. Wallace telling me this story, one day from work and told me she was not supposed to do that, but that man had passed away that night and that it had bothered Terri. I needed to be down there. When she arrived, Terri was lying there with his eyes wide open. He would not go to sleep. I mean, he was making no noise at the time, but I stayed there with him most all the day until he finally went to sleep. So I don't know what he saw, but I know he saw something, and I know it had, and now in retrospect, I know now, I knew that had to be something that was really bad. This is what keeps me up at night, okay? That people have been labeled as unconscious, not present, not in the room, and they have the ability to perceive. I don't know what he felt. I don't know what he understood, but he was disturbed and upset by it. And if the diagnostic error rate is that high, it's challenging. Now, Terri's brain also changed. These are studies that Henning Voss and Nico Schiff and my colleagues did of Terri's brain over an 18-month period, almost 20 years after his brain injury. And this is a diffusion tensor imaging MRI. And what you can see here in the red in the middle is the corpus callosum. And you can see how much has been lost in the midsection of the brain and how bad his injury is. What's interesting is he has the same red crudescence posteriorly, okay, in his parietal occipital lobe, conveniently circled up there, that 18 months later in another scan has regressed, and he has a new crudescence of activity here in his cerebellum, okay? So this was described as axonal sprouting in the brain and attributed perhaps to late recovery. It's not causal because we don't have, longitudinal shots of this, but it shows that the brain is dynamic and it's changing over time. Now, another way of looking at the vegetative versus the minimally conscious state is functional integration. And this is a study that Stephen Lauries did from Liège in Belgium, some nail bed pressure on patients in the vegetative state versus normal controls. And blue is the absence of activation. So a normal patient lights up a pain network. The vegetative patient does not integrate, does not have an integrative function. And then you see blue is the absence of integration. This is also seen here in a study that Nico did at Cornell, where they played narratives to minimally conscious patients and normal subjects of families were recording a narrative saying, remember when we were young, we went to the beach and mom did this and that. When they played the language forwards versus backwards, they lit up the language networks with forward speech, but they didn't when this in the same frequency spectrum going backwards. So they're responding to language and syntax and grammar and maybe content. And this shows the integrative function of the minimally conscious state patient versus the lack of integrative function in the vegetative patient. And Ben Carey called me for a comment in the New York Times, and this was right in the midst of the Schiavo debate in 2005. And I said, this study gave me goosebumps because it shows this possibility of this profound isolation. These people are there. They've been there all along, even though we've been treating them as if they're not. Again, this is the kind of stuff that should worry you. And it gets even more complicated because the categories keep on evolving because we learn more about the discordance between phenotype and neurogenotype, as it were. And this is a study that Adrian Owen did in Oxford, Cambridge, and also with colleagues at Liège. And they had a patient who was in the vegetative state behaviorally, and they put her in a scanner and they had her do a volitional activity. Imagine yourself playing tennis, imagine yourself walking through your house, and she lit up, and language networks as well. Imagine disaggregating words that were like creek in your neck and riverbed creek. They lit up language, motor, and spatial networks in the brain, even though the patient was behaviorally in the vegetative state. So this, we wrote a piece called Shades of Gray before there was another meaning to that title, New Insights from the Vegetative State, and I call this non-behavioral MCS, that patients could have a cognitive activity before they have motor activity. That kind of makes sense because thought always precedes action, and you don't always necessarily have the action. Locked-in state is another example that you have thoughts, but you don't have motor output. This patient, this paper was contentious because when it was published, that was her brain at 5 months. The paper was published when she was at 11 months, at which point she was already demonstrating behavioral manifestations of being in the minimally conscious state. But of course, she could have been stuck at that earlier state as well. And then, using a very similar paradigm, Martin Monti used that same methodology as a neuroprosthetic to reestablish functional communication with a patient who otherwise could not communicate. So they said, you know, imagine playing tennis for yes, imagine walking through your house for no, and there was one patient in this study who was able to use that as a way to communicate with the outside world, okay? Now, what's challenging about this is that later this patient with further interrogation did demonstrate behavioral evidence of being in the minimally conscious state. So this patient was never in the vegetative state, just misdiagnosed as vegetative but was minimally conscious. But the problem is that 30 of the 31 patients who were in MCS were identified by a behavioral metric called the Coma Recovery Scale, sort of neuropsychological testing. But not all the people who were identified by MCS could do the neuroimaging paradigm. So there's real issues of sensitivity and specificity, and this is not a clinical test, but for the patient for whom it was positive, it was dispositive, and it really was very important. And appreciating this patient was not in the vegetative state. So we have this paradox. I would hope that at this point, this very quick discussion, that you would think this is relatively interesting stuff. You guys kind of, even those of you who are sort of in the comatose state or stupor and coma, I hope. But you know, but it's really interesting. Yet these patients encounter, these families that I interviewed encounter a very disinterested healthcare system. There's this presumption that everybody who has brain injury is going to do badly, they get neglected, there's nihilism, that the brain doesn't change. Notwithstanding this evidence to the contrary, we see early decisions to withhold or withdraw care, to turn people who have severe brain injury into organ donors, premature palliative care recommendations, and they get discharged to nursing homes while they're medically unstable with thalamic storm and go to these godforsaken places that can't handle their medical needs. So the question is why? Why? Why is this the situation that we've encountered? And this goes back again to Fred Plum and the history of the vegetative state. And the right to die in America grew up in the vegetative state, and it was established as a negative right to be left alone. This is Karen Ann Quinlan, if you don't recognize her. And the withdrawal of care was predicated because of her permanent loss of her, as the case decision was, loss of her cognitive sapient state. And Fred Plum, this is a picture from 1976 when he was testifying before Judge Hughes, who was the Chief Justice of the New Jersey Supreme Court. He cites Dr. Plum's testimony. The brain works in essentially two ways, the vegetative and the sapient. We have no hesitancy in deciding that no external compelling interest state should compel Karen to endure the unendurable, which is interesting because if you're vegetative, you're not enduring anything. He was kind of thinking as if it was kind of like a cancer death. We'll give him a pass because it was a good decision in general. Only to vegetate a few more measurable months with no realistic possibility of returning to any semblance of cognitive or sapient life. Now, what happened here and what was so problematic was as American medicine and doctors got acculturated to the right to die, we overgeneralized the presumption of futility in the vegetative state to other brain states that resembled the vegetative state, like the minimally conscious state, and we didn't even know that it existed. So that nihilism, that presumption that nothing can or should be done for those people got generalized to this kind of generalized neglect. And injuries were immutable. I remember reading the autopsy of the Quinlan case. You know, her brain weighed, half of the normal weight. She had hydrocephalus ex vacuo, was this gelatinous gel, it was like 650 grams. And this notion of futility held in the Cruzan case, which went to the US Supreme Court, the Terri Schiavo case. And we kind of developed the neglect syndrome, which is when you have a parietal lobe lesion, you don't see half of your visual field. Well, there was a part of this brain injury population that we did not see, and those were the people in the minimally conscious state. Now, this schism between the nihilism and the hope and that maybe you can do something for brain injury is not new to the 20th century and Fred Plum and our generation. It goes back to a schism between Hippocrates and Galen. Okay? And this is the cathedral ceiling in the Montreal Neurologic Institute designed by Wilder Penfield himself, who actually studied with Ramon Cajal, whose picture we saw drawings on the outside. These are Golgi cells. And in the center here are early representations of the brain, ram's head, hieroglyphics. And here in the periphery is the Galenic refutation of the Hippocratic aphorism that all brain injury is a really bad thing and it's fatal. And Galen says, but I have seen the injured brain healed. Okay? And so have you, because that's what that DTI is. So this is an ancient schism. Here's another story which should maybe break your heart a little bit. Don Herbert Farman was in a house fire back in December 29th, 1995. Gets hit on the head. Everybody thought he had a anoxic brain injury, but if you read the story carefully, he's wearing a 100% oxygen rebreather mask as a fireman. So he really had more traumatic than anoxic brain injury, had bearing on his prognosis. Early in 1996, he talks sort of ever briefly, and then he goes down for 9 years, and everybody presumes he's in the vegetative state. And then in 2005, he starts talking out of the blue because an earnest physiatrist at the nursing home gave him an SSRI, maybe some Ritalin, we don't really know for sure, and he starts talking. So Mrs. Herbert calls up her son Nicholas, who was now 13 years old, was 4 years old when his dad got hurt. And she says, call your dad on the phone in his room. She's driving to the nursing home to see her husband, who's miraculously woken up all of a sudden. And young Nicholas says, my dad doesn't talk. She said, listen, call your dad. If you have a teenager, you know what this sounds like. Because there's this like thin thread. You want to hold on to this guy. He's been gone all this time. You don't want him to go back to wherever the hell he was before. Okay, I don't mean to curse, but it's an emotional thing. So from this book by Richard Blake, which I reviewed for JAMA, Don Herbert's incredulous to the teenage voices his little buddy Nicholas. This isn't Nicholas. He's a baby. He can't talk. He too was stuck in his prior time. This isn't Nicholas. Nicholas responds to his dad. I can talk. Do you know how old I am? He tells him, I'm 13. Don responds with a vernacular, remember he's a fireman. The spicy response encapsulates all the missed years and the flashes of his personality. The conversation concludes with Don telling his son that he loves him. Later, Linda, the mom, asks how Don, the father, sounded, and Nikki reminds her, this always gets me, I don't know. I can't remember ever hearing him speak before. This little boy is hearing his father speak for the first time because he forgot his earlier time with him. So for 16 hours, Don Herbert, who has occipital injury and is blind, Had all the firemen come in. He recognizes everybody's voice. He knows exactly who he is. He knows he's a father, and he feels guilty. He feels as if he had abandoned his family. He said, I've been gone a long time. He got more active. Then a couple of days later, he fell. He was going to come to Cornell for studies, and he caught pneumonia, and he died. So we had a meeting at the Institute of Medicine now, the National Academy of Medicine, and like what can we learn from these late recoveries? They should give us pause. What is the untapped residual integrative capacities of these injured brains? How might we accelerate them, identify these people, augment them, and sustain them? And there were three sort of areas of activity. One is neuroimaging, using functional neuroimaging to identify these people. Second, some pharmacologic interventions, which have since happened. There's been a large randomized clinical trial using amantadine, the flu drug, GABAergic, that can accelerate the recovery of consciousness. And zolpidem, in a small percentage of patients, can activate what Nico Schiff and Jerry Posner described as the meso circuit, which integrates the thalamus with the cortex and the brainstem arousal and integration. And the work which I'm going to focus on is work that we did, neuromodulation and thalamic deep brain stimulation. Okay, so what we're trying to do here, okay, is to get patients who have gotten to the minimally conscious state here, right, before the vegetative state became permanent temporally, and they're on this axis here of C, and we want them to move from the minimally conscious state to emerge into the emerged minimally conscious state, where the communication is reliable and consistent, and where they will communicate with you if you ask them on a reliable basis. This inflection point, nobody knows how that happens. And most things in medicine, the longer you're sick, the worse it's going to be. There's no time coefficient in MCS. It's a state, as I'll describe in a second, of potentiality. This is a book by Jose Manuel Rodriguez Delgado, who actually developed a stimiceiver that put into a bull in the bull ring outside a ronda in the caudate nucleus and had the bull stop. It was the front page of the New York Times. Some of you may remember that. How many of you remember that? Well, it's a big story, and Don Pfaff, of course, remembers it. But the metaphor that Delgado uses for the brain is in the potentiality. It's like a beautiful highway, able to accommodate traffic and facilitate the exchange of visitors along the many cities. A highway, however, cannot create cars, trucks, commerce, and the like, which circulates along it. The road makes functions possible, but by itself is a useless stretch of pavement. So the minimally conscious brain has that network response, but there are no cars on it. Our job here is how do we populate it, how do we activate it, how do we turn it on? And that's what the deep brain stimulation and these drugs have tried to do. So we published this article in Nature, and I will just very briefly go through the ethical challenges that I was the ethicist, the neuroethicist on the trial. And here's what we had to contend with. We had the legacy of psychosurgery. Okay, we're experimenting on individuals. We're going to do a phase 1 clinical study, more than minimal risk, without the prospect of direct medical benefit, in a patient who cannot provide consent. Okay, that to address those questions was 10 years of my life writing how many articles, I don't know. And the point that I would make was that of course these people are vulnerable, but it's one thing to do something to somebody. I think the argument was basically we're confusing respect for personhood with informed consent, as if they were interchangeable. And it is of course true that patients who have had capacity have had things done to them without their consent or over their objection. It's quite another thing to do something to somebody to restore their agency and their ability to participate in decisions. And that was the argument that I made. So the object here of our study was to provide them with the kind of agency that would allow them to participate and the restoration of agency. So when we wrote the protocol, we used legally authorized representatives, and we put in a caveat that if a patient ever regained capacity, we'd reconsent them. And they'd have the right to turn their stimulator off if we were able to achieve that kind of goal. But we had problems, and you mentioned the Parkinson's thing. We were able to generalize the risk of this deep brain stimulation was not as risky as the layperson might have thought, because by that point, 40,000 people had DBS or Parkinson's disease in similarly deep nuclei of the brain, and the mortality rate was essentially zero, and the complication rate was like 3%. Some bleeding, some infections, but it was certainly manageable. And by the time we were doing this study, DBS for Parkinson's disease was an accepted therapy paid for by CMS for drug-resistant movement disorders. So we were able to overcome the sort of the toxicity part of this because we knew that that wasn't that dangerous. We addressed the consent issues, we had legally authorized representatives, and we did something which I think is very important in neuroscience and science writ large, is that when we did our work, we had neuroethics and neuroscience together. We presented this at neuroscience the first time. We had our two posters. We had the ethics poster, we had the science poster, and everybody was on each other's poster. It was like, chocolate and peanut butter, like Reese's, better together, okay. We also designed this study. Ethics informed the study design. Initially, my colleagues wanted to go to a higher level of functioning subjects to do this, and I said we have to go as low as we could go where there's still a possibility it would work. So we needed to have a network response. We shouldn't do it in a vegetative patient because we don't have a network to activate. If we don't have a highway to drive cars on, it won't work. So we went to the minimally conscious state, but no higher, because then we could have induced incremental harm to patients who might have gotten better on their own. We also were sensitive to the time frame. We wanted people to be at least a year out from injury so that there was not going to be a spontaneous recovery. And we had consent with a legally authorized representation and stage authorization. And we had multiple IRBs and FDA. We had an FDA ID, so multiple levels of oversight. And we did this in traumatic brain injury because it was more likely to work than in anoxic brain injury. Our subject who we reported on in Nature basically initially had a Glasgow Coma scale of 3, which is as low as it can go without person being dead, had morphed into the minimally conscious state about 2 to 3 months after his injury, but was very low level MCS and had inconsistent command following with eye movement in his eyes, and a stable baseline with the coma recovery scale. And with the deep brain stimulation double-blind crossover study, he had improved cognitively mediated behaviors, limb control, and oral feeding, and he was able to, before, say absolutely nothing. With the stimulator, he could say 6 or 7 word sentences. He could say the first 16 words of the Pledge of Allegiance. He could tell his mother he loved her. He'd go shopping with her. He liked Old Navy. His name was Greg Pearson. He's in the book. He was a sharp dresser. He had gotten mugged in New Jersey, in Newark, I believe. But he would go shopping with his mom. He had improved limb control, and for the first time in 6 years, he was able to eat by mouth and didn't need to eat by a peg. And when the simulator was turned off, he lost his ability to communicate, and he lost his ability to eat. But there was a carryover effect from each tranche of on and off, and there was probably some plasticity. This is a CAT scan image of his brain. It looks like the electrodes are used, but that's just an artifact of the scatter around the metal electrodes. For me, the highlight of the study came to after we were post doing the study, and we were doing stimulation parameters one day. It was a hot summer day in New Jersey, and one of the physiatrists said to Greg, do you want to continue? Because it was hot, and every time you change one of the electrodes, the charge, there are 4 prongs on each electrode, and then you have to do the different frequencies, 125, 150 hertz, megahertz. And it was exhausting. And we were wilting, he was wilting, and they asked him, do you want to stop? And he said, yes. I looked at my watch, and I said, guys, this is a big deal. We have restored his ability to participate in a decision about himself through the use of a neuroprosthetic. Not at the level of informed consent or refusal, but at the level of assent and dissent. And I call this agency ex machina, deus ex machina. Now, not everybody liked what we did. Grant Gillette, who's a neurosurgeon in New Zealand and a neuroethicist, was very, very critical of me, although more recently he's written a positive review of my book. But in 2011, he wrote this article, Minimally Conscious State, Deep Brain Stimulation, and What is Worse Than Futility. And he said that there's the rub. He said, risk of unbearable badness, I think was his acronym, with nods to Shakespeare. And he was very, very critical of me. And he said, you just made these people now aware of how bad their life is. You've created a kind of a Frankenstein situation. And I was worried about that because I thought about this a lot. And I thought, well, we could turn the stimulator off, and it's reversible, it's not ablation, it's not psychosurgery. And then one day, Corinth Pecco, Greg's mother, tells me that Greg is depressed. And I'm like, oh my God, this is my my nightmare scenario, that in trying to help, we've actually done harm. And this is what she told me. And she told me, he was crying one day. I was visiting him, and I said, this is the mom, Greg, why are you crying? He says, I'm crying for Corey. And I innocently asked, having spent hours with them through the surgery and interviewing, who's Corey? And she says, that's his brother. That's his brother that does not come to see him. That's in denial. And even I, the mom says, I started crying because here he is. He's aware. He knows what's going on. He wasn't crying for himself. He wasn't upset about himself. He missed his brother. He was back in the room. And he was also worried that his brother was so upset that he couldn't bear to see him that way. So it's very important that we don't presume to know what these people are thinking and project our own sense of fear about disability and the like. And the goal here was to bring Greg back into the room. Deep brain stimulation has also helped us understand a lot about the biology of severe brain injury. And this is wonderful work that Nico Schiff, my terrific colleague and colleague of Don Pfaff's and others in the room, has worked out with Jerry Posner, showing the relationship, again, of the thalamus and cortical integration. And you can get this effect, an activation of the mesocircuit through deep brain stimulation, activation of the glutamatergic afferents, and derive the thalamus directly, or you can inhibit inhibitions using dopamine or zolpidem to take the brakes off the thalamus and activate the cortex. And again, in later illustrations, the thalamus also looks down into the brainstem. So it's arousal and cortical integration. And here's an image from an earlier study using zolpidem from South Africa, where you see the activation of the mesocircuit and the activation of the frontal cortex with zolpidem correlating with changes in brain state. Okay, final part of the talk. Why do we care? Why does this matter? Well, these patients, according to the interviews that I've done with over 50 patients, families in the United States, these folks are segregated in chronic care. They're denied services. They're misdiagnosed at a staggering rate. There's a presumption they're never going to get better. And they're denied voice. And for this population, voice and communication is, to a patient with a disorder of consciousness, what the ramp is for the person who's got a mobility challenge. The only way I know that you're conscious, or you know that I'm conscious, I hope you think I'm conscious, is not because you know my consciousness, but because I'm communicating with you. Communication becomes a proxy for consciousness. So if you deny people who could communicate the ability to communicate, you're denying them community. And what we have right now in the United States is these patients are separate and unequal. This is like the Jim Crow South of neurology. And I've been really interested in the parallels between the evolution of the American civil rights movement and what I think is a civil rights movement for this population. And tragically, right now, we have to fight simply for parity first before we have to fight for their true integration into society. And access to means first, if not yet equality. And we have a couple of problems in how we structure the financing of healthcare for this population. It's all somatic based. So we have this thing called the improvement standard or medical necessity, that if you don't demonstrate improvement, we don't pay for your care. And that makes sense, because if you're not benefiting from something, why should we pay for it? But the brain, sometimes the improvement that's occurring is under the hood. You can't see it, right? And brains recover by biological standards, not reimbursement criteria. So these people get too little, too late. They get rehabilitation for 2 or 3 months, if they're lucky, usually 6 weeks, 2 or 3 times a week. But what we're learning is that the axonal sprouting that we saw in that brain, in Terri Wallace's brain, that is exactly the same process that happens in children. So the brain is using a developmental paradigm to establish repair, regeneration. And if we think that children, imagine sending your 8th grader to school. We say, we'll give you 6 weeks of school. We'll give you 45 minutes 3 times a week. Let's see how you do. There's a longer a timeline here. And again, medical necessity makes sense when you know that the denominator of how long it takes for people to get better, but the natural history for these brain injuries is not known. And this is a paper from Lammy that says, and it's not really good English, though there's a low correlation coefficient between the duration of MCS and the outcome measures suggests that prognostic statements based on length of time a person is in the MCS cannot be made with confidence. So that means that it's not like the longer you're sick, the worse you're going to do. There's that notion of potentiality. You have to tap into that potentiality. This is the protagonist in my book, Maggie and Nancy Worthen, a woman who was had a brainstem stroke that went up into injury up to her thalamus, who came to us as vegetative. It turned out to be minimally conscious state. And she's talking about the challenges of the improvement standard. And there's been some litigation, this is work that I've done up at Yale Law School, about trying to change the improvement standard in a settlement between CMS and Medicare and some litigants. And the idea here is that lack of restoration of function is not disqualifying. Patients have to be individually assessed, and you can't deny categorically services to preserve capabilities, and you can also use it to prevent deterioration. But it's an ongoing challenge, and there's federal law, but at the local level, there's local care determinations. People are not getting care. And every time we have an article this month in Scientific American Mind, every time we publish something, it gets a little visibility. I get these horrible emails from families talking about the care that their patients' loved ones are not receiving, not getting basic rehabilitation, not getting a credible diagnosis. It's an ongoing challenge, and I bring it up. I know you're all scientists, but the science makes no difference if we don't have policies to sustain the good work in the future. So we have to enable people with the capabilities. This is an argument Martha Nussbaum has made, Amartya Sen, Venta Kapuram, that these are the tools that enable people to achieve their rights. But I want to say it's more than an insurance issue. It's really a civil rights issue. And this is where I want to end up. I would argue that segregation and these people in chronic care, their denial of voice is a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the UN Convention on Disability, where they argue that there's a right to be maximally integrated into society. They have a liberty interest, and they have to overcome this legacy of segregation, which goes all the way back to Jim Crow. And the notion was that, and this is a work of Timothy Cook, was a law professor, that children, black children in the South, didn't need to get an education because they were not capable of responding to education, and so too people with disabilities. And the fact that this happened at precisely the mere time was no mere coincidence of historical events. The historical record abounds with evidence that disability discrimination emanated from the same attitudes and prejudices fomenting at the turn of the century regarding race. These were all inferior beings, and we've tried to overcome that. And if you look at the Americans with Disabilities Act, the mandate for the elimination of discrimination against individuals with disability was because precisely societies tend to isolate and segregate them. And that is precisely what's happening to our population. When they wrote the ADA, they were not thinking about brain injury. They're thinking about mobility and gaining access to the workplace, okay, and ramps and the like. But it's very important. And in the Olmstead decision, which upheld the ADA in 1999, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in her majority opinion, said Congress explicitly, one, identified unjustified segregation of persons with disability as a form of discrimination. And for our purposes, okay, the lack of the restoration of functional communication is isolating. I don't know if you've seen this movie, Talk to Her, Habla con ella, the Spanish movie, Academy Award-winning film. It's about two women with brain injury. It was mistranslated in English as talk to her. In Spanish, it's hable con ella. Con is with, it's the preposition with. It's this relationality, this reciprocity that we're really trying to establish. So why is this all permitted? And as I was finishing my book, I got into this, where is the ADA? How come these people are not protected by the Americans with Disabilities Act? It would seem to be a blatant act of discrimination. And I realized they did not have the basic rights of citizenship. And so they did not get the protection of the law. So this is an old story, from Seneca Falls to Selma to Stonewall, okay? The dispossessed had to gain the rights of citizenship before they got the protection of the law. So there was a right to vote unless you're a woman, okay? There was a right to education unless you were a little black kid in the South. And until recently, there was a right to get married unless you were gay, okay? And I think this is the next civil rights movement. And when I talk to college kids, okay, this must be the new Trump administration, they're turning me off. No more civil rights, folks. We're done. Okay, turn those lights back on. Okay, I talk to young kids about this, and I talk about gay rights, and I talk about Obergefell, the decision in Obergefell, which is the gay marriage decision. Justice Kennedy said, which is so important. He said, you know, sometimes you'll learn something that changes your whole world, and what you thought was true is no longer true. And I would argue that what we're learning now about the injured brain and this discordance between what we see and what's actually going on in the brain is the kind of revelation that should change how we think about our obligations to this population. But when I talk to college kids, I talk about gay marriage, and I say, well, look, you know, my generation, you know, I'm in my mid-50s. I said, we didn't understand it, but we understand it now. We kind of caught up to your generation, and they sort of sit there very smug. There's some young people in the room there sit smugly. And then I turned to them. There's some young people I'll talk to here. I said, your kids are going to look at you and say, how did you treat conscious people like that? Why did you do that to them? And you'll have the same sense of guilt that we might have about how we thought about gay marriage 20 years ago. So I was struggling with all this, and I went down to see Hy Feldblum, who was the person who wrote the Americans with Disabilities Act, and she's a commissioner, Georgetown professor, and now she's a commissioner on the EEOC. And I was talking to her about this argument about language and community, and she said, oh, you're making an Olmstead argument. And I said, I'm really glad I'm making some kind of argument. Not being a lawyer, I said, what's an Olmstead argument? She told me about the Olmstead case, which is about two mentally retarded, mentally ill women who wanted to be deinstitutionalized in Georgia. And it went all the way up to the Supreme Court because Georgia didn't want to pay for the deinstitutionalization. And the basic decision was, unless it would bankrupt your organization, you have to put these people back into civilization and back into society, back into their communities. That's what we owe them. And basically, neuroprosthetics, the technology, proper diagnosis is a way to bring these people back. I think this is the civil rights movement of our coming generation, if we have a coming generation. And and again, you know, it's very hard to be concerned about this little sliver of the world when the rest of the world is changing so radically. But people are beginning to say that we have to act ethically in our own spaces. We have to be advocates for things that we believe in our own spaces, and then the collectivity will make a difference. I digress. So, but I'll end with a confusing question. Okay, we want to restore functional communication. We want people back in the room, but how much liberty do we give them to make decisions for themselves? Okay, what kind of weight do we give prosthetic communication? How do we assess capacity? What kind of decisions? Can they make decisions about the end of life? So when the Martin Monti paper came out, the yes, no, remember that image? I can't see you guys in the back. I got called again by the New York Times, and I ended up having the quote of the day, right? And I said, we've opened up a communication channel with this technique, but in some ways it's like a very bad cell phone connection. The bandwidth is not broad. And here, this is a painting by Matisse called The Conversation, two very stiff-looking couple. And they've got the whole repertoire of communication, but they don't seem to be communicating very well. I think this is a couple that needs a little help. So the challenge is, how do we give patients a voice without imposing upon them their obligations and responsibilities they're not ready yet to assume, because in these prosthetic communication techniques, they're dependent on the questions that we ask. They can't initiate queries. They've got varying attention. There's often a latency of response. I remember being with a woman who had severe brain injury, and she was doing occupational therapy, and she was sitting there as if she was absolutely doing nothing for 45 minutes. And then we looked at what she had written, and she said, my brain is like a stone wall. It's like a haiku that expressed exactly the challenge that she was facing. People could not respond because they don't want to respond, or the technology can be wrong. So a positive study is helpful, a negative study means nothing. So it's very important to think about how we'll integrate the patient back into the room when they have partial communication. It's much like how would you integrate a child's communication into an aggregate decision-making or an adolescent. But we have more experience with that. This is a person who comes back from the inability to communicate to having more of an ability to communicate. So what I want to conclude with, I think we have to have an agenda of inclusion. We have to have medical parity for these people. We have to have basic things like an ICD code for MCS. There's no way to track these people. We have to have treatments for the minimally conscious state, drugs, devices, neuroprosthetics, and we have to affirm the legal rights and civil rights of these very vulnerable people. And I'll end with my very favorite slide. This is Spain has a federation of acquired brain injury and a day of acquired brain injury. And their motto is, una vida salvada merece ser vivida, which sounds better in Spanish. But in English, it means a life that is saved deserves to be lived. So thank you for living through this hour with me. I hope you've enjoyed it. I appreciate your attention. Thank you very much.